Mágad the last Ceann Comhairle. This is your government's fifth and final budget, and it marks the end of your administration's time in office. And it is therefore a moment to take stock of all that has happened since 2011, to consider your record in the round and to assess the winners and the losers on your watch. I have to say that the picture that emerges is one worthy of any Tory-minded administration anywhere in the world. Those that have borne the brunt of what are euphemistically referred to as economic corrections are families and workers on low and middle incomes, people relying on social protection, and citizens relying on public services. The big winners have been the wealthiest sections of society, those that believe in low-wage or poverty-wage competition, and those that wish to cannibalise public services for private gain. So far from offering protection, your government has exposed families and workers to an obscene jamboree of cutbacks, of waiting lists, and of broken promises, living from day to day, week to week, month to month, just about making ends meet. You promised Taoiseach a democratic revolution, but in fact you have presided over a series of democratic somersaults and contradictions that have left this economy and our citizens damaged and vulnerable. Having made a pre-election pledge of not another cent to the bondholders, you, Taoiseach, made a post-election U-turn, proclaiming that you would not wear the slogan of debt defaulter on your forehead. It's now very clear that under Fine Gael and Labour, the slogan of indebtedness will be marked across our brows for many years because of the cowardice and the incompetence of your government. A massive burden of debt, an odious debt, the debt of bankers, of speculators, of developers, weighs heavily on this and future generations. And all the while, you busied yourself currying favour with the Troika and your friend Angela Merkel. That's your record, Taoiseach. This state now ranks second in the OECD low pay ranks. Huge numbers of workers in temporary, insecure, zero-hour work arrangements and jobs bridge scams to massage the live register. That is your record. Rents skyrocketing, sky-high variable interest rates on mortgages, social housing bills on the floor, almost 100,000 families in mortgage arrears, a tax on the family home. That is your record. Cuts to home help hours, to child benefit, to disability payments, to carers payments, to maternity benefit, to the fuel allowance, to back to school payments, and a charge for domestic water. That is your record in government. So you've created chaos, and now you want to talk up recovery. But recovery for whom? In the midst of economic chaos and vicious cutbacks, the wealthiest have still thrived in this state. The wealthiest 250 individuals in this state saw their wealth grow by 16% to €75 billion. Yes, that's €75 billion over the last 12 months. There's no fear of them, Taoiseach, and yet this is the group that most concerns and most animates you. You play the game of right-wing make-believe that going easy on the wealthy is a necessary precondition for economic growth and shared prosperity. That is a lie. Real recovery will not be possible without the wealthy paying their fair share. No more than that, but certainly no less. And it is that simple. Fair taxation is a foundation stone of real, sustainable and shared recovery. Half of those that work, Taoiseach, as has already been said, in this state earn €28,500 or less. That's where it's at for the average worker. Only the top 5% of workers earn €100,000 or more. Yourself, the Taoiseach, your ministerial colleagues, some of your advisors, and those that you rub shoulders with included. And today, again, you refuse to introduce a third band on individual income in excess of €100,000. In other words, an additional few cents in each euro of very high income. Why is that? Why is it that in the midst of the worst economic catastrophe faced by this state, that you refused, budget after budget, to introduce this fair measure? And why is it now that you refuse to make this measure part of an agenda for fair recovery? Today, you raise the entry threshold for USC, Universal Social Charge, to €13,000, and you've given yourselves a mighty clap on the back for that. That's still a very, very low threshold. It still means people earning minimum wage paying the USC. Now, is that really a fair or a progressive move? Is that really payback for low-paid workers? Sinn Féin's proposal would see all workers earning €19,572 and less taken out of the USC altogether. Our proposals would see all workers on a new minimum wage of €9.65 an hour. That's an increase of €1 as against your 50 cents per hour. It would see all of those workers exempted from USC. Now, that, Taoiseach, would be a real shot in the arm for low-wage workers and, indeed, for their spending power. But you see, you're not interested in them. The contrast in your treatment of those on very high incomes and those on average wages is very stark indeed. You've shown no reluctance to levy charges on lower income groups. In fact, you've piled on taxes on this group, the majority, with considerable gusto. You persist again today with water charges and a property tax levied indiscriminately against average and low-income families, against pensioners, against those with disabilities, and you are absolutely indifferent to the hardship, to the worry and to the anger that these unfair charges have brought. Do you think, Taoiseach, that tens of thousands came out onto our streets time and again to protest against these measures just for the heck of it? Do you not hear the voices of women, of men, of young and old telling you that these unfair charges are taxes too far? The truth is that you can afford, that you could afford, to abolish water charges and end the fiasco that is Irish water. You can afford to lift the pressure of the family home tax off families across the board. And these measures would represent real, tangible relief, a real break and a real sign of the beginning of a fair recovery for people up and down the country. You should be abolishing these taxes today. That's what you would do if you were serious about a fair recovery. That is what Sinn Féin would do. That is what Sinn Féin will do at the first available opportunity. Taken together, these measures would put €443 directly into the pockets of hard-pressed families. And your failure to end these unfair taxes reflects a deeply flawed approach to managing the economy and creating shared prosperity. You see, your persistence with water and property tax demonstrate your determination to place the greatest burden of taxation on low and average earners. Far from being progressive, as you claim, this approach means placing a disproportionate burden on people with less. That is your approach when it's all boiled down. So it's not that you are against high taxation, save except for very high earners. You're not against high taxation per se, as you constantly bleat. It is, in fact, that you refuse to introduce fair taxation. And the fact that the Labour Party has swallowed this agenda hook, line and sinker, and now advocates the maintenance of unfair taxation as loudly and faithfully as any of their Fine Gael cronies, tells its own tale. Taoiseach, you ratcheted up the hype and spin when you unveiled your capital spending plans last week. We saw it all. Aggregate figures over long time horizons, promises on the never never, the illusion of substantial investment. It was an initiative straight from the playbook of the last Fianna Fáil-led administration. Do you remember, directly before the last election, then Taoiseach Brian Cowan, flanked by John Gormley of the Green Party, pledging, amongst much fanfare, a 40 billion capital spend? Well, that spend never happened. Ever since coming into office, you have cut capital spending. You cut, as has been pointed out by my colleague Deputy Doherty, by 750 million in your first budget, and that set the scene for each subsequent budget that you have delivered. This has had the effect of depressing economic activity, of deepening and prolonging the recession. It has cost jobs, and it has left citizens with substandard, or in some cases, non-existent services and infrastructure. And all of the rhetoric today about capital investment doesn't disguise the fact that what you propose is totally inadequate to the needs of society and the economy. I believe it is the last installation of Fine Gael and Labour voodoo economics, or fantasy fairy tale economics, because just as the laws of gravity, the fact that night follows day, and the acceptance that the earth is not flat are commonly accepted across the population, so too is an understanding that investment is a prerequisite to growth. There is no way around it. And yet you fail to grasp that. In fact, worse than that, you cut again your capital budget. This is perhaps the clearest evidence that you have no plan. Maybe that's really at the root of this. You've no plan and you've no vision of how to build our economy and society following the ravages of economic crash and austerity. It is a clear demonstration that you cannot and that you will not deliver a fair recovery. And nowhere is this more evident than in the area of housing and homelessness. A young man found on Westmoreland Street is the latest homeless citizen to die a lonely and cold death on the streets of Dublin. This man, like Jonathan Corrie and Alan Murphy before him, are the most visible and extreme casualties of the economic collapse, of the vicious austerity agendas of your government and of Fianna Fáil before you. Now, government expresses sadness and sympathy on the deaths of these three citizens, and it's not for me to question the sincerity of those words in the aftermath of tragic loss of life. I do, however, question your understanding of why citizens find themselves in the hopeless despair of street homelessness. I do question your commitment to challenging and overcoming the reasons why that young man Why Jonathan, why Alan, and why so many others cower in doorways, seek shelter in bushes, and why so many more live lives of desperation in hotel rooms, in B&Bs and hostels across the state. Most homelessness, you know, is invisible. It goes recorded as people seeking social housing. Every person who sleeps in the box room of their parents' home, very often with their own children, or every person who sleeps on the sofa in their friend's place, is in reality a homeless person. So Taoiseach, the rough sleepers and those on the homeless list are only the tip of the iceberg, and a very large iceberg it is. We are, whether you acknowledge it or not, in the grip of not just a housing crisis, but a real emergency in this state. And it seems that you are content to offer sympathy, but not solutions. You've never, in your time of office, offered a viable plan to address the housing and homeless crisis. In fact, your piecemeal interventions lack ambition, and they lack any serious resolve to sort things out. Today's announcement, for instance, of 69 million additional euro is more to meet the eye than to respond to the crisis. It's a transparent attempt to save the blushes of Minister Alan Kelly in particular, and it will not wash. It's hard actually to fathom your approach on the issue. As a government, and Minister Kelly in particular, you've pointed the finger of blame at local authorities, at housing charities, at social justice campaigners, even at the homeless themselves. And it's all a bluff. It's all a puff of smoke, all in the hope of distracting attention from your responsibility for this housing crisis, this state of emergency, because this has happened on your watch. You are responsible for it. Yet today again, you failed the test. You failed to commit to getting even the first step right. So, 1,500 children homeless, many sleeping in emergency accommodation. It is a shocking statistic, but it's more than just that, because behind each of those numbers is real and lasting human and social damage. On your watch. We proposed an additional spend of 300 million to go into housing for next year. That's additional to the announcements that you have made. That, Taoiseach, is the scale of what is required to begin, just to begin, to come to grips with this emergency. I think you know that. I think you know that very well, and yet you turn your face against it. And instead today, you choose not to make this investment. You choose more tears, crocodile tears maybe, but no serious investment in solutions. The prospect of visiting accident and emergency in their local hospital is for many people the stuff of nightmares. Overcrowded, under-resourced, stressed out cauldrons of frustration. That's the popular view of A&E. And that popular view is based on reality. The realities of a system where daily trolley counts are the norm, an accepted normal practice in our hospitals. It's based on the experiences of very elderly people. In at least 3 cases this year, people over 100 years of age languishing on trolleys for 24 hours or more. It's based on the common experiences of people for whom trolleys were simply not available, people who felt very lucky to get a chair in the emergency department. There were 7,775 people on trolleys, hospital trolleys, in the month of June. That's the highest recorded level of overcrowding in the month of June since the trolley watch count began 12 years ago. That should give us all pause for reflection, because that does not augur for the months ahead. Where is this reality reflected in today's budget? Nowhere. You as a government are content to stand still. The chaos in hospital, it seems, is now confirmed government policy. Certainly Minister Howlin was expressing great satisfaction with his claim of 1,000 extra posts in the health service this year. I think he needs to talk to his colleague, Minister Kathleen Lynch, who has made it plain that some 1,500 nurses actually will leave the health service in that period of time. And the mathematics of that leads to a shortfall, a loss, not a gain within the system. Our budget proposal set out an additional $383 million in additional funding to provide for additional nursing staff, consultants, dentists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, to increase funding to disability and mental health services, and to increase ambulance cover. And yet your figures today do not represent additional resources for health in any significant way. It simply is a case of standing still. Your proposal to extend medical card cover for children under 12 is electoral politics pure and simple. It's very cynical too. It's cynical when you consider that many seriously sick and vulnerable citizens, including children and young adults, continue to go without medical cards. So what of the 13-year-old who's very ill, or who suffers with the disability, or the 15-year-old with significant medical need or disability? What about them? It's notable that you've done nothing to address the issue of prescription charges. Now, I've lost count of the number of older people who tell me that they now selectively fill their prescriptions, deciding which medicines to skip because the charge is too high at €2.50 an item. Remember your promise to abolish these charges before the last election? Well, so much for that. You've increased them by €2 per item, an increase of 400% in your time in government. Bravo for you. Our primary and secondary schools face huge difficulties in meeting basic running costs. Their level of capitation grant is woefully low. Teachers and parents across the state go to incredible ends to make up the shortfall and to keep the lights and the heating on in our schools, and they're to be commended for their efforts. Today was the day to increase capitation grants to primary, secondary school, to VTOS, to Youth Reach and others. But you fail to make this change, and you leave the places where our children learn and grow to penny pinch and to rely on voluntary contributions from hard-pressed parents. You've persisted also with your cut to guidance teachers in secondary schools. This was a very damaging and misguided cut. It's undermined the supports afforded to young people at a formative and sometimes vulnerable stage of their lives. Teachers, students and parents have consistently made you aware of this damage. Our budget proposal set out a spend of €14.7 million to reinstate 700 guidance posts across the state. You should today have made that investment in our young people. Since 2011, you've presided over a shameful 15% cut in resource teaching hours to children with special needs. This is the cut that every teacher I know identifies as the most vicious and damaging of all. And you made this cut at a time when the numbers of children requiring resource hours has grown substantially. It's grown by about 8,000 since 2011. What the cut has meant in practical terms for an individual child is a reduction from 5 hours to about 3 hours and 45 minutes per week. And it is absolutely imperative, urgent and a priority that these hours be restored. You've made a partial announcement today in respect of these resources. But your announcement does not cater for the needs of children, and it certainly does not make up the very damaging cut that you introduced of 15%. Your job today as government was to reverse absolutely and entirely that 15% cut, but you failed to do that. Former Labour Party leader and later Minister for Education Ruairi Quinn made a whole drama, if you recall, signing a pledge to abolish third-level student registration fees before the last election, or at least not to raise them. Fine Gael made that promise too. Short time later, ensconced in government with Fine Gael, Minister Quinn set that pledge aside, turned it on its head. The government has, over the last 5 years, increased the student registration fee by €1,500. In fact, it's doubled since 2011. Now, that's quite a turnaround, even by the standards of Labour and Fine Gael. This fee places a huge burden on students and their families, and it can make the difference between somebody pursuing a course of study or not going there. In terms of childcare, we know the drain that represents on people's income. I really hope that your proposal to introduce an additional preschool year will address the problems that we know exist in the current scheme. We know that capitation levels are a problem. We know that a 38-year week is not sufficient. We know of the exclusion of children with special needs and disabilities. Whatever way it works, this certainly will not be the kind of Scandinavian model of childcare so beloved of the Tánaiste the Joan Burton. There's no relief today, Taoiseach, on offer for single-parent families. You persist with the cuts against them, and your own figures reflect an 18% cut in spending on one-parent allowance. They also reflect a cut of some 20% in spend on back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance. They also reflect a 17% cut in spending on the back-to-education allowances. All in all, a very bad deal for families headed by a single parent, the very families that we know, bore most in respect of the years of austerity, and study after study and all of the analysis reflects that very, very clearly. In the course of his opening remarks, Minister Noonan invited us to reflect on a journey travelled over the past 100 years. While Minister Howlin, less epically, invited us to reflect on the journey travelled since 2011. I want to assure both deputies that just as the promise of the Easter Rising and proclamation for a free, equal and democratic Ireland is deeply ingrained in our collective memory, so too are the very immediate recollections of the economic calamity resulting from greed, corruption and crony politics. The effects of Fianna Fáil-led crash and Fine Gael and Labour cutbacks and austerity still live in the minds of people. So the ministers needn't worry. The people are not about to forget. The consequences of your targeting of low and average income families, of people reliant on social welfare, of our older citizens, of citizens with disabilities, of our traveller citizens, are real and current, and they are not forgotten. The people are not forgetting, and guess what? They won't allow you forget either. Today's budget is not about putting right the wrongs of the past. It's about, as you hope, winning the next election. So Taoiseach, go to the people. Don't hold off. Joan will get over it. Let the people have their say. Let them have their moment, and let you stand over this budget that favours again the haves and that turns a blind eye to the have-nots and to the public service needs of this state.